Australia has been subject to a growing number of finds, including just a few pterosaurs. And by a few pterosaurs, I mean 3, including things like Mythunga and Pharaohdraco. And these two actually group really closely to a new fossil pterosaur that brings the total number up to 4, so an entire 33% increase by just this one fossil. Thapunngaka shawi is a new species of anhinguarid pterosaur coming from Australia, and from the early Cretaceous, which actually Mythunga and Pharaohdraco were also anhinguarids from the early Cretaceous of Australia, and they were all relatively large, with Thapunngaka being the largest of them all, with a wingspan that, depending on which comparison to other animals you use, was probably around 7 meters or so, if not a little bit larger. In fact, this makes Thapunngaka the third largest anhinguarid pterosaur anywhere in the world, and they actually have a lot of fossils that are found in South America. So it's not just this single group isolated in Australia, they actually had a pretty good distribution across large portions of the planet. But the anhinguarids weren't the only pterosaurs knocking about in Australia during this time period. There was also an animal called Ezekiel, and it was a Targaryen draconoid. And yes, that is Targaryen, like the Targaryens in Game of Thrones. And yes, the fact that these animals just kind of go extinct in the mid-Cretaceous is still a better ending than the television show got. So while Ezekiel was different than the anhinguarids, it was still actually similar in a lot of ways because it was also from the early Cretaceous, and it was also within a larger group that contained both the Targaryen draconoids and the anhinguarids, and that's the ornithocheirids. And this pattern holds with the other pterosaur fossils coming from Australia. And while I did mention there's only 4 species known from Australia, there are other bits and fragments that are probably from ornithocheirids, at least mostly. There's one specimen though that's outside of this group. It's a Pterosaur, which these were probably filter feeders and weren't competing directly with the ornithocheirids, which were much larger and probably eating more active prey. So there's the background of the early Cretaceous pterosaur fauna of Australia. There's 2 groups, the Pterosaur, which were filter feeders, and the ornithocheirids. And Thapunngaka was definitely an ornithochérid. But where even more specifically does it group within that group? Well, it actually groups really well with the other Australian anhinguarids, that's Mythunga and Pharaohdraco. And this is at least a little bit unexpected because it was pretty much thought that a lot of the connectivity between South America, Antarctica, and then Australia would have let a lot of different taxa start migrating between these places. And especially with very large pterosaurs, it's been thought that they could fly very, very long distances. And so the fact that these Australian groups do form their own very distinctive clade within the overall anhinguarids does help to suggest that maybe they weren't migrating quite as far as we thought. It also helps to suggest that the anhinguarids were able to grow to pretty large sizes multiple times. And that's because it would have had to happen once with the Australian Thapunngaka and once with some of the larger taxa that come from South America. So they were already well prepared to become very large flyers. And as for the evidence of this split in multiple times of growth, it does also help to suggest that maybe there was more climate change going on in Antarctica than we had previously thought, and that may have isolated these 2 populations, where essentially only limited amounts of migration were able to occur between South America and Antarctica, at least with the pterosaurs. So they weren't able to quite get as broad of a global distribution as we may have thought. Hopefully, though, there will be more Australian pterosaurs found, as there is a lot of new paleontology work being done in Australia, so we can try and get a better understanding of how the pterosaurs were just spread around the globe biogeographically.